In the heart of a picturesque college campus, where ivy climbed the walls of red brick dormitories and laughter echoed in the air, room 314 held a secret that no one dared to speak of. Elizabeth Miller was just another freshman, eager to embrace the freedom of university life. Her days were filled with late-night study sessions, coffee-fueled laughter, and dreams of a bright future. But her nights were different. It started with whispers. At first, she thought it was just the sound of the wind squeezing through the old wooden frames of her dorm room windows. Then came the shadows, impossibly dark shapes that pulled in the corners of her room, defying the soft glow of her desk lamp. Her roommate Megan dismissed it as stress, laughing it off as the byproduct of too many horror movies and too little sleep. But Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling. There was something wrong with room 314. One night, as Elizabeth lay in bed, her body frozen with an unexplainable weight, she heard a voice, low, guttural, and seething with menace. "You're mine now." The following morning, Megan found Elizabeth curled in the corner of the room, her wide, bloodshot eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. She refused to speak, her lips quivering as if they held back a scream. It was only the beginning. Elizabeth Miller had always been the kind of person who lit up a room. Hailing from a small, close-knit town in Indiana, she was the first in her family to attend college. The prestigious Brookstone University, with its sprawling campus and old-world charm, seemed like the perfect place to start her new chapter. Her dorm room in Harrington Hall was small but cozy. The brick walls carried the weight of decades of history, and the scent of freshly waxed floors mixed with the faint mustiness of old wood. Room 314 wasn't much different from the others: 2 twin beds, 2 desks, and a single window overlooking the quad. Elizabeth shared the room with Megan, a lively sophomore who quickly became her guide to campus life. At first, Elizabeth's days were filled with the excitement of college, rushing to lectures, joining study groups, and attending campus events. But as the weeks passed, her cheerful demeanor began to waver. She started to feel uneasy in her dorm room, as if an unseen presence was watching her every move. It began subtly, lights flickering when she was alone, her desk chair moving slightly out of place, and her belongings mysteriously shifting overnight. She brushed it off as her imagination or the pranks of mischievous students. Megan teased her about being a scaredy cat, laughing as Elizabeth nervously glanced over her shoulder. But things took a darker turn one evening when Elizabeth returned to her room after a late-night study session. As she opened the door, she was hit by an icy gust of air, despite the room's heater running at full blast. Her textbooks, which she had neatly stacked on her desk, were scattered across the floor. In the center of the chaos was a single word scrawled in jagged, black letters on the wall: "Leave." Megan tried to rationalize it, suggesting it was a prank or vandalism. But Elizabeth wasn't convinced. The writing seemed to pulse with a sinister energy, and the room felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. Her nights became increasingly restless. She often woke up drenched in sweat, her dreams filled with visions of shadowy figures and a voice that hissed her name. Megan started to notice the changes in Elizabeth. Her once bright eyes grew dull, her laughter faded, and she began to withdraw from friends and classes. One night, as the campus clock struck 3:00 a.m., Elizabeth awoke to the sensation of fingers brushing against her arm. Bolting upright, she turned on her bedside lamp, but the room was empty. Megan was sound asleep, her back to Elizabeth. Shaking, Elizabeth stared at the corner of the room, where a shadow seemed to shift and move, despite the light. By morning, Elizabeth's behavior had changed drastically. She began speaking in strange, fragmented sentences, her voice unnaturally deep at times. Megan, terrified, called campus security, who in turn contacted the school counselor. The counselor, however, couldn't explain the strange occurrences. When Elizabeth's parents were contacted, they immediately came to the campus. But upon seeing their daughter, they were struck with a deep, primal fear. Elizabeth wasn't just unwell. Something far darker seemed to be taking hold of her. Desperate, her parents turned to Father Gregory, a local priest with experience in cases of spiritual affliction. Upon entering room 314, Father Gregory paused, his face pale as he clutched his crucifix. "This isn't just a haunting," he murmured. "This is possession." The air in room 314 grew heavier by the day, a suffocating presence that could be felt by anyone who entered. Elizabeth's behavior spiraled further out of control. She no longer recognized her parents, staring at them with vacant, unblinking eyes. Her once gentle voice now shifted unpredictably. Sometimes it was a low growl, other times it was a mocking, shrill laugh that echoed unnaturally in the small dorm room. Father Gregory began his preparations immediately, gathering holy water, blessed relics, and his Bible. "This won't be easy," he warned Elizabeth's parents and Megan. "Possession of this kind doesn't happen overnight. Whatever this entity is, it has been waiting, watching, and now it has claimed her." The first exorcism was held in the dorm room, where Elizabeth sat restrained to her bed. Her once radiant face was pale, her skin stretched taut over her cheekbones, and dark circles under her eyes gave her an almost skeletal appearance. As Father Gregory began to pray, the room seemed to react. The temperature dropped sharply, and the faint sound of scratching filled the air, growing louder with each verse. Elizabeth's body contorted in impossible ways, her limbs bending at unnatural angles as she let out an ear-piercing scream that seemed to shake the walls. "You can't have her," the voice roared, deep and guttural, echoing as if coming from every corner of the room. Father Gregory pressed on, sprinkling holy water and clutching his crucifix. Elizabeth writhed, her eyes rolling back into her head, but her strength was otherworldly. Megan, watching from the doorway, sobbed uncontrollably, her knuckles white as she gripped the doorframe. The voice taunted the priest, hurling insults and laughing mockingly. It recited private details about Father Gregory's life, things no one could possibly know. "You're weak," it hissed. "She's already mine." Despite the intensity of the session, Elizabeth seemed to calm slightly as Father Gregory's prayers continued. For a brief moment, her eyes returned to normal, and she whispered, "Help me." But just as quickly, the demonic force took hold again, screaming, "Leave her to me." After hours of prayer and struggle, the entity seemed to retreat, leaving Elizabeth exhausted and barely conscious. Father Gregory knew this was only the beginning. "This isn't over," he told her parents gravely. "This spirit is powerful. It's feeding on her fear, and on something deeper." Determined to uncover the root of the possession, Megan and Elizabeth's parents began investigating the history of Harrington Hall. They discovered chilling records. Room 314 had been the site of multiple unexplained incidents over the years. In 1968, a student named Clara Jennings reportedly took her own life there after complaining of dark voices and shadows that wouldn't leave her alone. In 1982, another resident was found speaking in tongues before vanishing without a trace. As they dug deeper, they learned of the land's darker history. Before the college was built, the area had been home to a notorious asylum, where reports of abuse and mysterious deaths were rampant. Rumors of occult rituals conducted by some of the staff only added to the lore. The more they uncovered, the more Megan began to feel the same oppressive energy Elizabeth had described. She started hearing faint whispers when alone, and shadows seemed to follow her movements. It became clear, whatever had taken hold of Elizabeth wasn't just a random spirit. It was something ancient, something malevolent, and it was bound to the land. Father Gregory devised a plan for a final, more intense exorcism. This time he enlisted the help of another priest, Father O'Malley, known for his expertise in battling demonic forces. Together, they prepared for the most dangerous ritual of their careers. The night of the exorcism, the room was transformed into a battleground. Holy relics adorned every surface, candles flickered in the oppressive darkness, and a faint scent of incense filled the air. Elizabeth was once again restrained, but this time, her body trembled violently even before the priests began their prayers. As Father Gregory and Father O'Malley chanted, the air grew thick with a sulfuric stench. Elizabeth's voice, no longer her own, shouted in languages none of them could understand. Objects in the room began to fly, books and picture frames crashing against the walls. "You'll never save her," the entity bellowed, its voice layered with malevolence. "She belongs to me." Father O'Malley stepped forward, holding a large crucifix. "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to leave this child of God," he shouted. Elizabeth let out a blood-curdling scream, her body arching violently before collapsing back onto the bed. But the battle was far from over. The entity retaliated, manifesting its full power in the room. Shadows grew into clawed forms, lunging at the priests and knocking over the candles. The air vibrated with unholy energy as the priests continued their prayers, unwavering in their faith. The room seemed to convulse, as if the very walls were alive. Elizabeth's face twisted into an unnatural grin as the voice hissed, "This isn't over, you'll all pay." But then, as the prayers reached their crescendo, the room was filled with a blinding light. Elizabeth let out one final, agonized scream before collapsing into silence. The entity was gone, or so they thought. The silence that followed the exorcism was almost as unnerving as the chaos that had preceded it. Elizabeth lay motionless on the bed, her chest rising and falling weakly. The air in the room felt lighter, but the scars of the ordeal remained, burn marks on the walls where candles had fallen, overturned furniture, and the oppressive memory of the entity's voice still lingering in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Father Gregory knelt beside Elizabeth, whispering a final prayer as he gently placed a hand on her forehead. "She's free," he said with quiet conviction. Father O'Malley nodded, though his expression was tinged with exhaustion and caution. "For now," he murmured under his breath. Elizabeth's parents, overcome with relief, rushed to her side, holding her hands and whispering words of comfort. Tears streamed down Megan's face as she stood at the doorway, watching her friend slowly return to the person she once knew. But the victory was short-lived. As Father Gregory began to pack his belongings, he noticed something strange. The room, though seemingly peaceful, carried an unsettling stillness. The faint scent of sulfur lingered, despite the open windows. His gaze fell upon Elizabeth, who stirred slightly in her sleep. Her lips moved, forming silent words. "Elizabeth," Father Gregory called softly. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, they looked normal. But then, her expression changed. A slow, unnerving smile spread across her face. In a voice that was not her own, she whispered, "Did you really think it would be that easy?" The air in the room seemed to shift again, growing cold and heavy. Elizabeth's body convulsed, her back arching off the bed as a guttural laugh erupted from her throat. The priests immediately sprang into action, reciting prayers and commanding the entity to leave. But this time, it was different. The dorm room began to shake violently, the walls groaning as if the building itself were alive. Shadows oozed from every corner, merging into a dark, writhing mass that hovered above Elizabeth. Her body rose from the bed, suspended in midair, as the laughter grew louder and more menacing. Father O'Malley clutched his crucifix, his voice unwavering as he shouted, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this place." The entity roared in response, a deafening sound that seemed to reverberate through the entire building. Lights in the hallway flickered, and students began to gather outside the room, drawn by the commotion. Megan, frozen in terror, watched as the shadowy mass began to take shape. A grotesque figure emerged, its form shifting and unnatural, with hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce through everyone in the room. "It's not just her," the entity hissed. "This land is mine. It always has been." Father Gregory and Father O'Malley pushed forward, their combined voices rising in prayer. Holy water sizzled as it made contact with the dark figure, causing it to shriek and writhe in agony. But instead of retreating, the entity lashed out, its shadowy tendrils knocking over furniture and smashing windows. Elizabeth's voice joined the cacophony, a mix of pleas and threats. "Help me," she cried one moment, only to snarl, "You're all going to burn," the next. As the priests intensified their prayers, the entity seemed to falter. The grotesque figure began to break apart, its shadowy mass dissolving into smaller fragments. The room filled with a blinding light once more, and with a final, ear-splitting scream, the entity dissipated into nothingness. Elizabeth collapsed onto the bed, her body limp and lifeless. For a horrifying moment, everyone feared the worst. But then, she took a deep, shuddering breath, her eyes fluttering open. This time, they were unmistakably her own. Father Gregory placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. "It's over," he said, though his expression betrayed a lingering doubt. The room fell quiet, the oppressive energy finally lifted. But as they began to gather their things, a knock at the door startled everyone. A campus security officer stood there, his face pale. "You might want to see this," he said, leading them down the hall. On the walls of the corridor, written in dark, dripping letters, were the words, "You're next." The aftermath of the exorcism left a scar on everyone involved. Elizabeth was taken to a nearby hospital to recover, where doctors could find no physical explanation for her ordeal. While she remained weak and disoriented, she seemed to be herself again. Her parents stayed by her side, refusing to leave her for even a moment. Father Gregory and Father O'Malley, though exhausted, stayed in the dorm building for several days, blessing every room and corridor. The students, though skeptical about the supernatural explanation, couldn't deny the eerie events they had witnessed. Many requested transfers to other dorms, and room 314 was officially closed off by the university. Megan visited Elizabeth often, though the visits were bittersweet. The bond they once shared seemed strained, as if something unspoken lingered between them. Megan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right, that the darkness hadn't fully left. One evening, while sitting by Elizabeth's hospital bed, Megan noticed a faint scar forming on her friend's wrist. It was a strange shape, almost like a burn mark, and it seemed to grow darker each day. When she asked Elizabeth about it, her friend looked at her with a blank expression and said, "I don't remember." Father Gregory, too, felt uneasy. Despite his years of experience, he couldn't forget the entity's parting words, "This land is mine." The words echoed in his mind as he returned to the site of the old asylum. Standing in the overgrown field where Harrington Hall had been built, he clutched his crucifix tightly, feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. Records of the asylum revealed a history of cruelty and occult rituals, but one entry stood out, a warning from a long-deceased chaplain. "The darkness here is bound, not destroyed. It waits for a crack in the veil, a willing soul to call it forth." Gregory realized the fight was far from over. The land itself was tainted, cursed by something far older and more powerful than he had faced before. And though Elizabeth had been freed, he couldn't help but wonder if the darkness had truly been defeated, or if it was simply lying in wait. As the weeks turned into months, life at the university slowly returned to normal. Room 314 remained sealed, its door marked with a heavy chain and a warning sign. But late at night, the few students who still lived in Harrington Hall swore they could hear faint whispers coming from behind the door. Elizabeth returned to her studies the following semester, though she kept mostly to herself. Megan tried to rekindle their friendship, but Elizabeth seemed distant, as though part of her had been left behind in that room. One night, as Megan walked past room 314 on her way back to her dorm, she felt a sudden chill. The whispers she had heard during Elizabeth's possession were faint but unmistakable. Turning back to look, she noticed something scratched into the wood of the door, barely visible in the dim light, still here. Megan hurried down the hall, refusing to look back. As the campus clock struck midnight, the chains around room 314 rattled softly, as if something on the other side was waiting for its next invitation.